I wonder what this button does.
Aside from creating face-melting bass, sound synthesis can add an incredible magic to your music. Far from being an arcane art reserved for the few elite musicians who could afford giant walls of hardware synthesizers, the fields of sound design and synthesis are now easier and more accessible than ever. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use this amazing modern magic to take your tracks to the next level.
From wonderful pads, plinky plonky pluck sounds, warm and mellow bass tones, to harsh and noisy filth, the range of sounds that can be created using synthesis is extremely wide. Sound synthesis is used more and more in popular music, composition, and in soundtracks, and I want to help you to be able to use this tool to the fullest, without the pain of having to endlessly browse through hundreds of preset sounds. After this tutorial, you will have more freedom to create your own sounds or adjust presets so that they fit your imagination much better. I want to help explain and demystify this topic that sometimes can seem complex and confusing by breaking down each part into manageable, bite-sized sections. My name is Moonlight, and I'm an award-winning composer, a music producer, and a recording engineer. I have 25 years experience writing, recording, and producing music. This video has been designed to be a one-stop shop, somewhere anyone at any stage of their music production journey can learn all the basics of sound synthesis. This advice is for the most common type of synthesizer that anyone who aspires to be a fantastic sound designer needs in their toolkit, the subtractive synthesizer. This includes synths such as Serum, Massive and Massive X, Vital, Diva, Pigments and Phase Plan, as well as many hardware synths and native synthesizers built into your own digital audio workstations like Ableton or Logic. If you check the video description, there is a link to a totally free synthesizer that can be used if you don't already have access to one. I've also designed an accompanying PDF that has a quick reference guide for all of the synths mentioned. It also has a jargon buster section that will give you detailed and easy to read descriptions of the technical words you'll find in this video. I've developed an easy to follow 5-step system that helps you create synth patches from scratch, and this teaches you all the basics about synth sound design. At the end of this video, we'll dive into a full demonstration where we create a number of different patches together, applying this easy to follow formula, and ending with something a bit more advanced where we break down the sound from my track War Poetry, which we heard at the beginning of this video. Before all that, however, we really need some background information and context. Without this info, there's a chance it could wreck your ability to understand the more advanced parts of synthesis. After I'd learned this, I felt that my knowledge about synthesis was truly complete, and I was finally able to explore this amazing world of sound to the fullest. In the not-so-distant past, humans only had one way of creating varied musical sounds, by using instruments. The thought that you could create almost any sound imaginable without using instruments would have sounded like pure lunacy even as recently as 100 years ago. To make a sound, we must first create a vibration, giving some energy to our instrument. Blowing or striking or bowing our various equipment will create the desired vibration, and each instrument has its own unique sound. But what happens if we want to make a new type of sound? Do we have to invent a whole new type of instrument? In the past, the answer was more or less yes. But now, with our access to the new magic of sound design, we can create almost any sound we can imagine.
Welcome to Synth Science Secrets. Today we'll be discussing the magical properties of sound. As we already explained, sound is just stuff vibrating back and forth like this. Just the same as the ripples on top of the ocean, when this happens, we create a wave pattern. This is called the waveform, and it just means the particular shape of any wave. Now, this is my guitar. As you can see,
These waveforms are real and exist on the actual strings themselves. I love this demonstration as it shows that these are real objects that exist and are not just theoretical. You may also be able to see that the higher the note is, the smaller the waves on the waveform become. When you hear a tiny mosquito fly past, it has a very high pitch. It's vibrating its tiny wings very many times a second. A fly has bigger wings and it can't move them anywhere near as fast as the mosquito, and that's why its pitch is lower. This shorter repetition of waves means that the waves repeat more frequently. This is where we get the word frequency, which simply means the number of repetitions of a wave per second. Another word relating to waves we have describes how high and low these waves reach. This is called the amplitude. You may recognize the first part of this word, amp, as the same particle from the word amplifier that you might use with your guitar. Remembering that should help you recall that amplitude is about volume. When I hit the strings harder, the waves get bigger, and so their amplitude increases. On this analysis, we have frequency along the bottom, and volume reaches up vertically. If I put one frequency through this, you can see we get just one peak. When I change the pitch, this peak moves up and down. Remember, frequency is simply how many repetitions of the wave pattern happen over time. The higher the frequency, the more frequent the wave repeats, and so the higher the pitch of the note becomes. Simple. When we play a guitar and we put it through the same analysis, we can see there are many more frequencies than just one. The higher frequencies contained here are called the overtones, and some of these overtones are in tune with the original note. Have you ever heard this sound? This is the sound of harmonics, where we can excite one of these in-tune overtones that would normally be present when we are playing a regular note. We can actually number the expected harmonics in a sound with whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And this will become relevant a little later when we explain some of the sounds we hear in synthesis. This natural pattern is called the harmonic series. The number one spot on this list is actually the note that we hear, and it's called the fundamental. It is also usually the loudest frequency too, and that's why we hear a note as a single note and not as a big smush of loads of frequencies together.
This is the sound of a violin playing the E string. As you can see here, there are a number of clear peaks in the overtones of the sound. If I boost the individual frequencies, you can hear that these natural harmonics are present in just this single sound. Harmonics on a waveform look like the little peaks and valleys you find superimposed over taller and longer waves. This detail will be present on almost any waveform we look at. On a sine wave that is completely smooth, however, there is none of this extra information.
So, why does a guitar sound like a guitar? When we put our guitar through the same analysis, we can see that there's a different pattern to the overtones. And this is one of the reasons that different instruments have varied sounds. We can say that the instruments both have a different timbre. This is a French word with an unfortunate spelling for pronunciation in English, but it effectively means the quality of sound created by different instruments. And it was used to explain this phenomenon for centuries. The exact pattern of higher harmonics and overtones create different timbres for the different instruments. And this is one of the elements that causes variation in instruments' sounds. So, wouldn't it be cool if we could manipulate the harmonic content of a sound without having to invent new instrument shapes and playing methods? Well, that's effectively what we're doing using our old friend synthesis. So now we begin at step 1 of my system designed to take you through the process of creating your own sounds from the ground up. I ask you to picture that we're creating our own new magical instrument out of simply thin air in our imaginations. And in step 1, first we'll be selecting what kind of instrument that might be. Each synthesizer must have a sound source. This is the place the noise originates from. We need to get our vibration happening.
The part of a subtractive synthesizer that generates our waveforms is called an oscillator.
You may be familiar with these various shapes and patterns, but can you tell them apart from each other just by ear? We can imagine these different waveforms almost like different instruments. Each one has a different sound to it. As we learn more, we'll be able to sculpt these instruments into different shapes, and we'll be able to control how we play these too. Each basic waveform has a unique timbre. And from what we know about timbre, that means they have different patterns of harmonics. To help you remember what each waveform sounds like, I'll reference the closest orchestral sound. Let's take a quick dive into these with some examples. The most basic waveform we have here is called the sine wave. This is the purest true wave pattern, and you should be able to see that it has no other harmonics interfering with the smooth oscillation back and forth of this wave. In fact, it's the only pattern that has no harmonics whatsoever. This sound doesn't occur in nature, and so that is the first interesting quality we encounter with synthesis. We can create sounds that are impossible to create by any other method. Now, if that's not a form of magic, I don't know what is. Simple sine waves with a bit of help can make good sub-bass sounds, the lowest possible note heard in bass. Sine waves can also be used to replicate other light and mellow tones, such as flutes in the orchestra. When we use more complex wave shapes, all of these have higher frequency content in the form of harmonics. The sawtooth wave contains every harmonic going up in the natural harmonic series. You don't need to memorize anything about these harmonics or these wave patterns, but just be aware that each waveform has a different timbre because of these features. You'll easily be able to tell these sounds apart by the end of this section. Hearing the sawtooth wave again, you'll hear that there is a very bright and buzzing harshness to this sound. It almost sounds a bit distorted. This feature makes it really good for harsher and distorted sounds. This waveform sounds probably closest to something like a violin. Next, we're going to look at the square wave. This sound actually emits every other harmonic from the harmonic series. So instead of seeing a pattern of just normally 1, 2, 3, 4 in the harmonics, we'll see 1, 3, 5, 7. This pattern gives this waveform a kind of nasal or hollow quality to it, and it's often associated with woodwind instruments like the clarinet. You may be familiar with this sound as well if you've spent any time gaming in the early 90s, like me, or have played any retro titles from that period. A lot of game soundtracks prominently featured this wave pattern. Somewhere between the square wave and the sine wave, the triangle waveform has a similarly hollow sound due to containing only the odd harmonics. This sound is closer to a sine wave in its actual shape, and so doesn't contain the same level of harshness that a sawtooth or a square wave have. This one sounds closest to a French horn. The best piece of advice I can give for learning about waveforms is to simply just use them. There are no rules on how these should be applied in synthesis. You can change the quality of each of these sounds in so many ways that the selection of the waveform itself can sometimes play only a minor role in the overall sound. Most oscillators on synthesizers have the ability to do several things at once. It's very common to have 2 or 3 of these oscillators on a synth so that you can stack these sounds together or make them work together in interesting ways. I will touch on a few other types of oscillator now that are more complex than the ones we've mentioned already. It's worth knowing about these, as most modern software synthesizers give you the option of far more than just these first few basic waveforms. Wavetable synthesis has complex waves that can be morphed over time to create interesting timbral shifts in tone. From morphing between regular waveform patterns to complex and varied tones, this form of synthesis offers great variance in its timbre and has great possibilities for modulation, which we'll be discussing in an upcoming chapter. Pulse waveforms are like if you took a square wave but made the square narrower or thicker. As you can control exactly how wide this wave is, there's usually a dial to control the width of this pulse. Pulse waveforms sound like this. Finally, noise is an extremely useful waveform. It can come in various different flavors. However, the key feature of noise is that the frequency content does not have a harmonic relationship to a note. Basically, these sounds contain a random assortment of frequencies and do not have an identifiable note. This is useful as many real-world sounds contain some level of noise, such as a snare drum. Step 1 was to pick our oscillator and where we start to build our imaginary instrument. Step 2 in the system will be where we learn to play our instrument in different ways. This is how we conjure our sound, plucking, striking, or bowing imaginary strings to bring the sound into existence. So we've started with how we can get sound happening in our synthesizer, but the way we process these sounds going forwards will give them the qualities that will make them into sounds we want to actually use in our music. The way we manipulate a synthesized sound over time is referred to as modulation. There's an entire section of the video dedicated to this, but I first wanted to discuss one of the most basic forms of modulation important to any sound. The way a sound begins and ends is different for almost any sound. A clap occurs very suddenly and dies away more slowly, whereas a slow bowing of a violin string can get louder over time gradually. The pluck of a string might start suddenly, but then the string will ring out afterwards for some time. What we're discussing here is a type of volume modulation. That essentially means how the volume changes over time. It is sometimes referred to as amplitude modulation. Remember, amplitude is essentially just another word for volume. When we have control over the onset, sustain, and the way a sound ends, we can use another very helpful feature of synthesizers called an envelope. A helpful way to remember this is to imagine that this is how the sound is packaged and presented to us. This envelope will control how we play our note. Let's look at an original clap sound. As you can see, the waveform of this sound starts very suddenly and then quite quickly fades away over time. A more musical example of a sound with a similar envelope might be a bell, a sudden onset of sound and a slow fade away. If we look at a guitar pluck sound, we can first see that there is a sudden onset, but then the sound doesn't immediately fade away and we have a period where the sound sustains as we hear the note ring out. We can kind of say that the pluck section of this sound is almost one element on its own, and then the sustain is another, and the pluck is significantly louder than the sustain. Lastly, our violin crescendo. The sound slowly builds up and slowly fades away. So how do we replicate this in a synth? First, let's go ahead and talk about the names of each of these phases of sound. The beginning of a sound is usually called the attack. Sounds with a short onset, like our clap, have a very fast attack phase. The long-bowed violin note, however, has a much softer and longer attack phase. The next envelope element is called the decay. Some sounds start with a louder beginning. The example I keep using is the pluck of a string, but it applies to any sound where the start is louder than the rest of the sound. When we hit a xylophone, for example, we get a loud and woody clunk before the note continues to ring out afterwards. The decay is simply the time it takes for the loudest bit of the sound to come back down in volume again. Next is the sustain level. Unlike the last 2 points for attack and decay, which relate to how the volume changes over time, sustain is actually the volume level that the sound reaches after the attack and decay phases. So if you see on this graph of volume over time, you affect the horizontal values of the attack and decay. You choose the time component and how long those moments are. And for sustain, you control its vertical position, simply choosing a volume for the sound to sustain at. Lastly, we have the release. This is again a length of time that the sound takes from playing until it fades back again to zero. Typically, a release phase occurs after a note has finished playing. Again, it can be short or long. These are the 4 properties: attack, decay, sustain, and release. This is sometimes abbreviated to ADSR. And so if you've ever seen those letters on a synthesizer and wondered what they were, you now have solved a small mystery for yourself. When I was a young musician just getting into synthesis, this is one of the areas that kind of stumped me. Particularly sustain, considering it controls volume, whereas all the others don't. Eventually these all clicked for me, but it would have been enormously helpful to have someone explain this in detail to me, so I'm hoping I've achieved that here. What I would nevertheless recommend doing is selecting a single waveform and playing around with these values and seeing how it affects the sound. Nothing will beat your own experimentation with these settings, but I'll do a demonstration of this now so you can see it in action. Here we have a simple square wave. If we have no envelope at all set, the sound will suddenly start and stay at its maximum volume for the duration of the note, and then it ends instantly the moment I release. This is sometimes useful, and don't feel you can't use this type of envelope setting. Next we have a sound with a quick onset and then a fade to zero with the release. This is similar to what we might expect for that bell or clap sound. For the pluck envelope, we have a quick attack and decay with our sustain set to a lowish value so that the note isn't very loud during the sustain section. Lastly, we have our long attack, long release. The volume gradually swells up and back down again for this sound. Very useful for pads and other lush soundscape type sounds. In step 2, we chose envelopes to design the way our new instrument should be played. In step 3 of my system, we now start to create the size and shape of the body of our instrument. Is this going to be a bass instrument, or do we want the body to be thin and reedy, or somewhere in between? This is where we can create the overall tone and shape the timbre directly. Not limited by the confines of what's possible with materials, we have the freedom to sculpt whatever timbre we desire. So, we've spoken about one way to modulate or change the volume of our sound over time. Now we can talk about another way of changing our patch. Filters are a way to change the frequency content of our synth patches. This is why it's important to know that most sounds contain frequencies that are higher than the note we actually perceive. In this section, we'll be able to listen to those other frequencies separately and hear how our sound changes when we affect them. A filter is a special type of equalization, or EQ, that most synthesizers have. It works by generally removing certain frequencies from sounds. It subtracts them, and this is the reason we call it subtractive synthesis. We start with a very full and broad spectrum sound like a sawtooth, and then we shape that sound by removing frequencies from it. This sound is called a filter sweep. If you've heard any electronic music ever made, I'm 99.9% confident you'll have heard this sound. This is a filter being modulated over time to change the frequency content of the sound. This sound uses what's called a low-pass filter. The way to think about this is that it lets all of the low frequencies pass through the filter, like a gate. The higher frequencies are cut out. The opposite of this is called a high-pass. This filter cuts out all of the lower frequencies. Here is the exact same filter sweep from before, but using a high-pass filter. Filters don't actually have to move over time, they can be static and unmoving. The reason we use them is that we can shape a sound more directly. When we use a standard waveform, such as a sawtooth, it's very bright and has a lot of frequency content across the full spectrum. This can be a good thing, as it makes the sound very present, but sometimes we want our sound to fulfill a role in our music, and sometimes cutting out frequencies will help it fit better. Mixing the two previous filters together, we end up with what's called a bandpass filter. This will only allow a narrow band of frequencies through. This sort of filter can create an old-school compressed telephone vibe by heavily restricting the frequency content of the sound. There are many other filter types, some of which act more like EQ rather than filters, and some that have unique properties. But I think this is a good beginning for most people and covers the main filter types. One main setting you need to know about filters is called the cutoff frequency. This is the frequency at which something changes. On the visual representation, you can see the cutoff very easily. A second important setting on almost every filter is called resonance. This is where we actually boost the cutoff frequency to accentuate that frequency range, and it looks like this. Those familiar with electronic music, again, are probably familiar with this sound. Resonant filters can give a more aggressive and accentuated effect than a filter with none. Sometimes people describe this effect as sounding plasticky or nasal. Compare this low-pass filter sweep with no resonance to this one with it. Lastly, in this filter section, we can talk about filter envelope. Similar to the volume envelope we discussed earlier, filter envelope performs a filter movement over time whenever the note is played. Here you can see the filter is triggered every time the note sounds, and this movement is controlled by the same type of ADSR envelope as before, except this time, instead of modulating the volume, we're modulating the cutoff frequency of the filter. Step 3 was about shaping the body of our new instruments with filters to create the tone of the instruments that's in our minds. In step 4, we now add some secret sauce to our patch. We sprinkle in a bit of fairy dust to bring the sound from being flat to having dimensions, and from being dull to sparkling to life in full Technicolor. We add this magic touch now in the system because in step 5, we actually gain the ability to have deep control of almost everything we've learned so far, even this step. Effects are really where you can bring your sounds to life. Even something as simple as adding a little bit of reverb to your sound can add a whole new dimension to the sound we're creating, placing the synth in its own imaginary acoustic space. Distortion can add some delicious grit or harshness to the sound, and that works by actually adding harmonics in. Delay, similar to reverb, gives the sound dimension and adds a set of echoes that fade into the distance. Other common effects are phases, choruses, filters,
ring modulators,
compressors, expanders, EQ, and saturation. There's no need to feel overwhelmed here. There are a lot of options when it comes to effects, but as a beginner, my advice is to start by experimenting with reverb, delay, and distortion, and experiment out from there. We're just adding some sprinkles of that fairy dust to make our patches sparkle and come to life. In the final portion of the video, where we'll make a few patches together, we'll look at some options when it comes to effects, and we'll test them out in more detail. Step 4, we just learned, was about adding effects to bring some extra spice to our sound. But in step 5, my personal favourite step, we'll add in all of the expression and ability to play our instrument with emotion. We'll gain the ability of a virtuoso that has intimate control over every aspect of their performance. This section is where we start to take our knowledge of synthesis to a more advanced level. Modulation is simply the change in any synth setting over time. We've had to discuss two types of modulation already: volume automation with an envelope and frequency modulation with a filter. The reason these two have been discussed separately is that they are two of the most basic forms of modulation, and they're usually available right away on the front end of your synthesizer. Modulation, however, can be a very big topic. We can affect almost any setting gradually over time. To create a vibrato effect, like a violinist might do by bending their strings back and forth, we can use modulation to affect the pitch of our oscillator. Another interesting playing style is tremolo, where a note is played over and over in quick succession. We can also create a similar modulation in our patch by modulating the volume off and on again very quickly. All of these possibilities and more are available with modulation. Synthesizers usually differ quite a bit in their modulation capabilities. You can create modulations inside the synthesizer, or you can simply record yourself changing these settings over time, and then save your own custom modulation. When we do this, we create what is known as automation. We're effectively automating how these modulations take place over time. Back before digital synthesizers were popular, if I wanted to create a filter sweep, for example, I would have to record the output of my synth and physically record myself moving the filter cutoff knob with my hand. Luckily these days we have many more options on how we can control these parameters. Often synthesizers will come with more than just a single ADSR envelope. And as we spoke about in the last section, sometimes there's a second ADSR envelope that can control the filter movement, for example. But sometimes there are multiple envelopes, and they can be used to control a whole bunch of different things. We're able to modulate any setting whatsoever that can be changed in the synth if we take the option of recording ourselves performing the action live. Most modern synthesizers, however, give you the option of modulating almost any setting you can actually touch anyway. Although this is not a hard and fast rule, and some synthesizers are more limiting in this regard than others. But always remember, if there's a knob that can be changed, it can often be modulated, and it can definitely be recorded. As well as ADSR envelopes, we should also discuss another type of modulator that features on almost every subtractive synthesizer, the LFO. This stands for low frequency oscillator. When we say low frequency, what we mean is that instead of the wave repeating so fast that we hear a note, the wave slowly oscillates so that we can use this slow oscillation to control other things in the synth. Remember this shape? This is our old friend, the sine wave. It gently oscillates back and forth in a very smooth fashion. If we connect a sine wave LFO to our pitch, for example, we would create the vibrato effect. The LFO reduces the frequency at the bottom of the wave, the note gets lower, and increases it at the top, the pitch gets higher. As a demonstration, here's the pitch unaffected. And this is the pitch with the modulation applied. Now let's try another modulation. This square wave is interesting as the values are either 0 at the bottom or 1 at the top, meaning the modulation switches on and off constantly. Let's connect this wave to the volume of our patch. This is the tremolo effect. We can perform multiple modulations at once, and these can stack on top of each other. We can control how fast our LFO moves with a speed setting, and we can change the shape to many of the original waveforms we had access to before. Modulation is extremely powerful, and it has the ability to control many elements outside of volume and frequency. We can use the LFO to control the wavetable position on a wavetable type oscillator, giving the really interesting morphing timbre. We could use the modulation to control the amount of distortion we have on a sound. We could use the modulation to detune our patch until it is no longer a recognizable pitch. The options are almost endless. The best option is to see what modulation is happening in some of your favorite sounds. Can you hear a filter moving? Is the volume or the pitch moving up and down? Are the effects changing over time somehow? Some sounds will also have much less in terms of complex modulation, but remember that ADSR envelopes will probably still be controlling the volume. Modulation is a complicated topic if you get into the meat of it, but it can be one of the most exciting steps when creating patches and can add that element of performance to your sounds. And so the final step of my system was to add modulation. And with that, I'm officially done with this magic metaphor. In the final portion of this video, we're going to take everything that we've learned so far and we're going to start applying it in practice so you can see these principles happening in real time. We're going to make some patches together, including a bass sound, a pluck instrument, and a pad. And we're going to end the whole video by looking at the neurobass sound from my track War Poetry that we heard at the beginning of this video. So now we've entered the fun part. I realise you've had a lot of information to absorb in the rest of this video, but this is the section now where we can see all of our hard work in action. I get excited at moments like this because I'm a massive nerd for sound design and I've always loved the process of actually making sounds. We're going to be making a number of different patches now, and I'll take you through each step of my system again to really cement these ideas home for you. Although you can follow along step by step if you want to, as this will work on basically any digital synth, this section is designed to help you understand why each part of the process is important and what the general possibilities are for sound design. When I'm working with my one-to-one students, I always find the best option is to give people the range of possibilities and let people experiment out from there. Just following along by example and doing everything exactly the same doesn't teach you as much as when you use experimentation to help push your knowledge further. I also think it's important to hear sounds in context, so we'll be using some of my tracks from my upcoming release as the backing for this. So let me just play some of the music we'll be sound designing to. This first track is called Vectoid, and this is a kind of build-up section. So we obviously have some bass already happening here. So if I just sort of get rid of the bass sounds here, this is what it sounds like without the bass. So we'll essentially be sound designing a new bass for this section. And instead of like a number of different sounds like there are in this bit, we're going to make one sound, and it's called a Reese bass. It's a really popular sound that's found in lots of like bass-centric music like drum and bass, dubstep, and other genres. So the most obvious thing a bass patch needs to be is low-pitched. We want those low rumbly frequencies that we can feel in our chests. So instead of playing basically in this section of the keyboard, we're going to be playing sort of down here. This synth is called Phase Plant. It actually comes with the ability to add as many oscillators as you want, but I'm not going to use too many because most other synths only allow the ability to add like 1 or 2, maybe 3 oscillators. So these kind of bass sounds can be made with almost any waveform that has a good amount of higher harmonics. The usual first choices for this are a sawtooth or a square wave. So I'm going to start with a sawtooth wave here. As we're making a bass patch, it can be useful to just tune your oscillator down an octave, which is what we'll do now. So I'm going to move this semitone section down 12 semitones. That just makes it easier to play
in the bass range on my keyboard here instead of having to reach all the way down the other end. I'm now going to enable a feature that you can find on almost all oscillators called unison. This has the effect of adding voices to a single oscillator, almost like having multiple copies of the same oscillator playing together. If these are slightly detuned from each other, you end up with a sort of chorus effect. So this is with unison added, and I'll add some detune. This actually transforms our single sawtooth wave into something way brighter and richer. As we have access to more than one oscillator in almost every synth, a good option can be to add a sine wave to the bottom end to reinforce the lowest bass notes. This is essentially our sub-bass. So this is without the sine and with. If you're listening on your phone or on small headphones, it might be harder to hear those low notes. So just keep that in mind as we go forwards. For those who want to follow along with the exact sound, you can reduce the polyphony of your patch to 1 and add legato and add some glide, and this will create this sliding effect. So step 2 in the system would be to look at the envelopes. Now in this particular sound, I'm not actually going to be using the envelopes particularly. I'm happy with the sound starting immediately and then ending immediately. That will give you this sort of immediate start and release. However, if you did want to add something to this envelope, you could potentially add a little bit of release. That would sound like this. So step 3 is adding filters. So we have some fun options for this sound. Filters usually remove some frequency content from our patches. And because we're making a bass sound, we want to ensure we don't actually get rid of too much of our low end. Adding a high pass here would actually cut all of those lovely juicy low notes out. If I added a high pass to this, it would sound like this. So as you can see, we've lost all of the low end there. So I'm instead going to add a low pass to this. If I just mess around with the cutoff point, I can find an area of the sound that I kind of like. So now that the sound doesn't have quite as much high frequency information, it's going to be a bit richer in terms of the arrangement. If I play this with the track, and that might be a sound that we want. If I open up the filter again and try again, it'll sound like this. I'm going to stick with this filter shape for the moment, because in the next step we're going to add some distortion, which will actually bring more frequency content back into the sound. So the next step is effects, and one of the most widely used effects, especially in this kind of sound and bass in general, is distortion. So if I add in some distortion, you'll hear that it adds some more frequencies back into the sound. So this is without the distortion and with. Another way that you can add distortion is by using a multi-band distortion unit, which will actually separate the different bands of frequencies, and you'll be able to distort those individually. So in Phaseplant, there's a way to do this using a plugin called Multipass. Multipass here splits the signal into 3 different bands, and then we can add different distortions to each one of those bands. This is the low band. I can solo these for you. And this is the mid band, with one type of distortion, and then the high band with yet another type. There are also some great VST plugins that you can use to do this effect, such as Homicide or Trash 2, which have multi-band distortion capabilities. And there's also some free options out there as well. So if I demonstrate this without the multi-band distortion, and then with, you can hear just how much that distortion brings out new frequencies. There's much more higher frequency content in the sound than there was before. Next, I want to quickly talk about reverb. We'll talk about some other effects on the other patches that we make. But reverb is a great effect, and it can basically improve almost any sound that you make. And to show you two different options here, we've got a really large reverb, which has got a long decay time. And we can use this for modulation later, modulating the position on and off. And now I'll show you a small room reverb. It sounds a lot smaller and tighter. Reverb places your synth in its own imaginary space. It sounds like it's actually really coming from somewhere or inside a space. And this adds realism and liveness to your sound. Now we've added our distortion and reverb, I'm going to try playing this with the track again. Lastly, we'll talk about modulation, which is the last step of our system. And I can show you how we would add modulation to this patch. So here I'm going to add a new filter, and this LFO here is going to control the filter cutoff position. To create a modulation, you just simply click and then drag it onto the modulation destination. You then drag up to control how much the modulation affects the sound. If I have just a small amount, modulation only moves a little bit, and if I add it all the way, it will open up and close completely. This sort of modulation can add a wobble sort of effect that you'll find in a lot of different music. To demonstrate the power of modulation, I'm going to create a new modulator, which is going to be an LFO with a sawtooth shape. This means that the modulation will keep rising gradually and gradually until the point it returns back to zero. This modulator I can use to control the speed of our original modulation, making our first modulation get faster and faster over time. Another type of LFO I can add here would be a random LFO, which will add a random value to an assigned setting. If I add this to the reverb mix, then we will sometimes have reverb and sometimes we won't, and this will be controlled completely at random. These sounds are really versatile, and just by very slightly changing different things, such as like your filter or your modulation or your effects, you can end up with a whole variety of different sounds. Here are just some examples of some respaces that I've made. So you can see the possibilities are really quite varied. The next sound that we're going to be looking at is a pluck sound. These kind of sounds usually hold a melodic role in your music. If you can remember, one of the distinguishing features of a pluck is its envelope shape, that we have a loud beginning and followed by a softer sustain. And so we're going to be looking at that next. I'm going to be using a different section of music as the example for this bit. And this section occurs just before the build-up that we were just listening to. So, first of all, I've created a little bit of a pattern here for during this section of music. So just to hear what this pattern sounds like, I've got a simple square wave with absolutely no other effects. So first of all, I'll delete this square wave and we'll start again from the oscillator section. This time I'm going to use a wavetable instead of a simple waveform. As I explained in the video, wavetables have the ability to morph through different sounds, and this gradually changes the timbre over the time. This table starts with a sine wave, moves through to a triangle, a sawtooth, a square wave, and finally ends with pulse wave modulation, where we squish the square wave down. So this has all of the basic waveforms here. It's just in a table of waves. And this can be changed over time to change the timbre. You can hear how the timbre morphs and changes during that. I recommend experimenting with different wavetables, as you'll be able to get different timbres depending on which ones you choose. As you can hear, it gets crunchier as we get further into the wavetable. So for now, let's move on to step 2, which is envelopes. The envelope in a pluck sound is arguably the most important part of the pluck sound. And to get a pluck sound, you should just copy this shape essentially. You need a fast beginning and probably some release. Make sure you don't remove all of the sustain, otherwise your note will fade away immediately to 0. I'm going to play this as I change the envelope so you can hear the sounds change. So at the moment we have no envelope set. I'm going to make the beginning shorter. And now I'm going to add some release. And we already have a pluck sound. This already sounds really good in my ears, but we're going to do some more to accentuate this pluck later. As we can usually add more than one oscillator in almost all the synths we'll be using, I'm going to add another oscillator. This one I will keep as a standard wave. I'm going to use a triangle wave, as a triangle wave pattern isn't quite as harsh as the other wave pattern that we're using. And I'm going to bring this envelope to a similar position as the last one. This might not sound like it's doing an awful lot at the moment, but if I play around with the level, you'll hear how it affects the sound. It's adding a little bit to the body of our sound. I'm actually going to tune this second oscillator an octave and a fifth higher. That actually matches with the third harmonic that you will get in the natural harmonic series, and it will add some brightness to our sound. If we have it mixed in very loud, it will sound like a separate note. If we bring the mix down, it will actually sound just like part of the harmonic makeup of the timbre of this sound. In order to accentuate this pluck sound, I'm going to add in some noise. Instead of repeating the exact same envelope this time, I actually want my noise to die away completely. So now we're going to look at filters. If you remember from the video, filters are kind of like how we shape the body of our instrument. It's how we get a specific tone. This instrument is sounding much more mid and high range. So two good options for this sound would be a bandpass or a high pass. As I've got some ideas of what I would like to do with this sound afterwards, I'm going to be selecting a bandpass. So this is without the filter. And this is with. You can hear it limits a lot of those higher frequencies. If I play with the cutoff position, I can get it to a position that I'm kind of liking. The higher up I move the cutoff, the thinner and more reedy the sound becomes. So now we'll look at the effects. And like in the rest of the video, I'm only going to be looking at distortion, reverb, and delay. So first of all, I'll quickly add some distortion. Distortion, if you remember, is going to bring some more harmonic content back into the sound. Without distortion, with distortion. So we don't always just add distortion to add that grit and nastiness. We also sometimes want to just bring out a bit more liveliness to the sound. I'm now going to add a small room reverb. This again will just place my patch in its own little space, giving some liveness to the sound. Finally, I'm going to add some delay. This is going to really transform our sound and bring it into a position sounding quite different. So the delay sounds like this. As you can see, it's kind of transformed this sound into something completely different, and this was something I had in mind for this sound all along. Lastly, we'll look at modulation. I'm going to show one type of modulation that I have planned previously for this patch. So the first thing I'd like to do is add some filter envelope. This means that the filter is going to respond every time a note is played. So I'm creating yet another pluck type envelope. This will give a sort of a wow effect with the filter moving up and down. We'll take a listen to this with the track. So now you're starting to get the hang of these processes. I'm going to speed things up a little bit. We're going to make a pad sound now. And this pad is not going to be to everyone's taste, but it is going to be to my taste. I like sounds that sound like they're broken or going wrong in some way or sound old and nostalgic. So we're going to look at some unique ways to introduce those ideas into this pad. I'm going to be using a different track for the backing for this. This is the other track from my release, and this one's called War Poetry. This is a kind of a verse section. So the two ideas that I'm going to be using to make this pad sound a bit wrong and a bit broken are, one part of the pad is going to sound a little bit out of tune, a little bit distorted, as if it was being played on an old tape. And the other element is that we're going to create a sort of crackling fire, stuttering sort of sound. And this will be done by modulating some noise. The first thing I'm going to do is we're going to create the pad bass. I'm going to add 3 square wave oscillators with some unison. In order to make the pad type sound, it's quite often a good idea to have a long attack and a long release. This will mean that the pad swells in and back out again. Other elements that will increase this effect are going to be in the effects section, such as longer reverbs. I'll just start with one of the oscillators. And I'm going to increase the attack and release of this, and we will end up with a kind of a classic pad sound. I'm going to repeat the same procedure with 2 more oscillators. The first one is tuned up an octave higher, the second one is tuned up 2 octaves higher. This will add some brightness to the patch. We'll return to the noise oscillator in a little while. First of all, let's do some filtering on this sound. Using this sort of filter almost sounds like the sound is older and maybe a bit broken. I'm going to also add some distortion to this sound, so we increase that sense that this is being played on some sort of old tape. The next effect I'm going to add will introduce some sort of pitch drift to the sound. This will be done by adding a random oscillator which controls the pitch. If I increase the effect, you'll hear it a bit better. This slight pitch drift is very reminiscent of what old tapes sound like, and it adds a bit of an uncanny, nostalgic feel to this. These kind of sounds you can hear with bands such as Boards of Canada. So I'm going to move on to our fire sound. This is done by creating a noise oscillator, which has a very fast-moving random oscillator controlling the level. So this is the noise oscillator without the random modulation. And if I add this random oscillator, you'll see this random LFO controls the level of the noise, which adds this sort of stuttering, fire, broken sounding effect. Just to tame this sound a little bit, I'm going to add a filter and modulate this filter with the same random oscillator. And the overall effect that we have for this sound sounds like this. This sound actually changes the track quite a lot and makes it seem a bit more uncomfortable and unsettling, and I really like this effect. Hello, buddy. Ugh. This is my boy Samson. He obviously wanted to say hello. Hey, buddy. Well, can you see him? This is him. This is my son. Okay. Daddy's busy. Okay, right. So now we've reached the final part of this video. This section is less about following a step-by-step tutorial and more about inspiring you to approach sound design in new and creative ways. I want to give you a window into my process as an experienced sound designer and hopefully demystify some of these slightly more advanced processes. By the end of this, you'll hopefully have fresh ideas and techniques to experiment with. We'll be focusing on the bass sound from War Poetry that we heard at the beginning of this video, breaking down the process behind its design. To start with, let's listen to this bass sound again quickly. I'll just play this on its own. What you're hearing here is actually rendered audio. So this is no longer just in the synth, and it's been chopped into a little riff. These are all separate sections of a longer piece of audio. But let me take you back to its raw synthesized origin. This is the synth patch that it came from. The approach for creating this sound is similar to what we've covered earlier. It begins with an oscillator rich in harmonic information. From there, the sound is shaped with heavy modulation, using processes like distortion, filtering, and pitch bending. For example, this LFO here modulates the harmonic content of the waveform, creating a rhythmic triplet pattern. That's this dig-dig-dig that you hear in the pattern. So that triplet pattern is created by this stepping LFO. There's another LFO here which controls the pitch bend that happens at the end of this phrase. And using random modulation, I'm modulating a number of different filters to cut and boost different frequencies to create a sort of swooshing movement in the sound as well, such as can be seen here. These randomly moving filters introduce movement and unpredictability into the sound. A key element in this patch is a preset from Phase Plant called Kicked Wobbler. It drives low-pass filter movements whilst also modulating a distortion coming in and out, resulting in a crunchy, distorted filter wobble effect. And that's controlled by this macro here. So let me just play this with it on. I've also attached another macro which controls the cutoff position of this filter. You should be able to see that filter opens more as I turn the cutoff knob up. Speaking of the macro controls, the controls at the top of this patch all affect different parts of the modulation, and I can change the patch gradually as things move along. These macro controls allow you to shape and control the sound on the fly. By tweaking these controls, you can evolve a simple bass patch into a longer and more complex idea. This technique is something the producer Mr. Bill refers to as creating an idea jam. Essentially, it's a long stretch of audio that you can chop up later to discover interesting riffs. So here is a long section of audio after I've performed these different movements. As you can hear, there's a lot of modulation and things changing over time. Then what I'm able to do is to chop up little sections of this. If I like this particular section, for example, I can take this out and put this here. I can do things like reverse it. I can change the pitch. I can stretch it. And various processes like this. Here is a section which has had a number of things chopped up. You can hear there's lots of different ideas in there. These techniques help uncover unique variations. External effects can add even more layers, and modulating these effects over time can keep things fresh and dynamic. Here's another multi-effects unit. By embracing this method, you're not just designing sounds, you're creating an endless library of ideas. You can build your own sample packs, create entire tracks from a single concept, or stumble upon completely unexpected and exciting directions. The possibilities are practically limitless. To give you an idea of a sort of an end result, this is one of the drops from this track. If you're interested in a more detailed breakdown of this exact process, then please let me know in the comments. Hopefully this inspires you to push the boundaries of your sound design further.
If you made it to this portion of the video, then please let me know by covertly including the word squirrel into a comment you would leave down below. My EP Poetic Geometry will be coming out on the 10th of January 2025, and that will include both the tracks that we used in the demonstrations earlier in the video. I wanted to say thank you for letting me, a complete stranger, teach you something new. And if you want to follow for more music-related shenanigans, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.